Thank you, Elizabeth. So next, we have Raquel Lemos, that works at the Champalimaud Foundation. She's a postdoctoral fellowship from FCT. She has a PhD in neuropsychology from the University of Coimbra, where she worked with Professor Isabel Santana at the neurology department. Also with an awarded PhD FCT fellowship. She did an internship at Columbia University with Professor Yakov Stern on cognitive reserve. Her main focus of research has been the neuropsychology of Alzheimer's disease and related disorders, with adaptation and validation of cognitive tests.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to be here presenting our work, the novel approaches to assess cognitive function and cognitive reserve. So just to remind you that Alzheimer's disease is the principal cause of dementia and it's the main cause of memory impairment and the global cognitive decline in the elderly. And in the stepwise manner, we would like to know, because we know that in the general population with no cognitive impairment, some people will develop mild cognitive impairment, and some people among the mild cognitive impairment patients will develop Alzheimer's disease. So this concept, MCI concept, is a very interesting and important because subjects that these patients are at a higher risk to convert to Alzheimer's disease a few years later. That's why it is also known as a prodromal Alzheimer's disease. And as we all would like to know, which are the patients, the mild cognitive impairment patients that are at a higher risk to convert to Alzheimer's disease and to predict this conversion. In cognitive domain, memory impairment is essential to the diagnosis of both Alzheimer's disease and MCI, and it's also a strong predictor of dementia's development. And as a neuropsychologist, in the current neuropsychological assessments, we can have several tests to assess memory and to assess these impairments that are such as story passages or lists and pairs of words. But we can criticize them because generally they do not allow to control the strategies that the subject is using to encode or to learn the material and then later on to retrieve or to recall it. And to look at the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, this memory impairment should be characteristic of this pathology because there are other pathologies that also have memory impairments. And this can lead to a misdiagnosis. So the deficits in the encoding and the storage of memory during the neuropsychological assessments should be distinguished from other conditions that are mainly due to attentional difficulties or to inefficient retrieval strategies that the subject is using to learn the material. And there's the suggestion of using different paradigms where in the phase of learning and encoding the material, the neuropsychologist or the person that is assessing the subject uses semantic cues to direct this. So instead of people to learn a word, we will encode it regarding to their semantic category. And later on, when people retrieve the material, when they recall it, we can use this same semantic cue to help them to recall the material and to know if we can predict from encoding to storage the material and then to recall it. And the test that is mainly used, it's the free and cue selective reminding test. This test controls attention and cognitive processing because it requires subjects to learn the items, as I said, regarding their semantic category. So we are controlling the way they learn the material. And then these same category cues used in the retrieval will control the way they recall the material. So just to take a brief look at the test, we have a list of words to be reminded, but instead of us to read them, we will categorize them regarding their semantic category. So for example, instead of me to say you the word apple, I will ask you what's the name of the fruit. So you are encoding this word regarding its semantic category. And then we ask subjects in a free manner to say and to recall all the words they remind. And for those words that are not freely reminded, we use the same category cue, so what was the name of the fruit, to guide and to help subjects to reach that word. And as I said, it is very important for us to have a clean way to show the memory impairment of Alzheimer's disease patients, because other conditions have also memory impairments during neuropsychological assessments, and this can lead to a misdiagnosis. So we went to check and to compare the performance on this test between frontotemporal dementia patients and Alzheimer's disease, because this is the second most prevalent dementia, and because it's regular for them and normal to have memory impairment during neuropsychological performance. And what we saw was that these patients, the frontotemporal dementia patients, had a memory impairment, but they benefited from this cued semantic cueing, whereas the Alzheimer's disease patients did not. And Alzheimer's disease patients were 25 times more likely to have an impaired test, and we can say that maybe their memory impairments, generally, it's due to attention difficulties or inefficient retrieval strategies, because when we help them and when we give these semantic cues, they can do it. As expected, the test was able to identify both Alzheimer's disease and MCI patients, and was also able to discriminate them with good values of sensitivity and specificity. And when we compare the performance on this test with Wechsler Memory Scale, which is a well-known and widely used memory test during neuropsychological assessments, we saw that the free and cued selective reminding test was actually more accurate in discriminating the two pathologies and was, fortunately, less influenced by the educational level of subjects. We also divided at baseline the mild cognitive impairment subjects regarding their performance and their impairment on these tests using the cutoffs that we suggested. And we saw that almost half of the patients of the MCI group were very alike Alzheimer's disease. So they had a very similar pattern of impairment than Alzheimer's disease patients had. And we went further on and we followed them for 2 years. And we saw that 33% of these MCI patients actually converted to Alzheimer's disease. So several measures were significant in the prediction from MCI to Alzheimer's disease. We have a biological footprint, as is the APOE genetics allele, and also the Wechsler Memory Scale subtest that was significant, and also, as expected, the free and cued selective reminding test. But this was the only measure in a multivariate analysis that was able to significantly predict the elevated risk of conversion from MCI to Alzheimer's disease. So I can stress out that the free and cued selective reminding test, it's a valid and accurate test, was more accurate than other tests in discriminating MCI from Alzheimer's disease and was less influenced by the educational level. It was also able to isolate the amnestic syndrome of the hippocampal type as representative of typical AD, and this is very important for us as neuropsychologists, and was an useful tool in the objective characterization of the memory impairments of the Alzheimer's disease spectrum, and was valuable in detecting Alzheimer's disease at its prodromal phase, as is the MCI. So we want now to move a little bit further on, and looking again to our stepwise graph, I think we all would love to know which are people in the general population that doesn't have cognitive impairments and will develop cognitive impairments such as MCI. And we reach one cognitive measure, as is the cognitive reserve, that can help us to reach this. So cognitive reserve can be defined as a concept that explains why two subjects in the presence of the same injury or brain damage cope in a different way. And there are only a few measures to assess this cognitive reserve. So some demographical indicators, such as the educational level, leisure activities, or demanding jobs that people perform, but also in neuropsychology, we have only a couple of measures that we use to assess the premorbid IQ. And this can be criticized, and that's why we suggest the dual task costs as a potential measure for cognitive reserve. So dual tasking is the concurrent performance of two tasks that can be performed independently and measured separately, such as a motor task and a cognitive task. So performing them at the same time has a cost, and we call it the dual task cost. For example, of walking velocity, that is increasingly seen as a robust measure of cognitive reserve. The motor task we suggest is for people to walk in a self-paced manner, and the cognitive task to perform subtractions of serials of 7. And the dual task is to use these two tasks at the same time. So the rationale behind this was that Holzer saw a protective effect of the executive function and episodic memory that was, against the speed decline, was greater in subjects with a higher cognitive reserve. And this concept plays a role in regulating later changes in both age and disease-related gait impairment. So we would love to untangle this relationship and to understand which one happens first, if the gait changes or the cognitive dysfunction, and then if this could help us in the early identification of subjects who are at a higher risk for later cognitive decline. So in our general approach, we developed an experimental design to validate this for healthy volunteers, and what we found was that when performing the two tasks at the same time, there were some differences in all gait parameters. So when people were walking, they had a kind of a worse performance than when they were performing a single task alone. Our future aim is to validate the dual task cause as a measure of cognitive reserve in cognitive impairment. So we would like to study this in a large group of healthy elders, and we then follow them longitudinally to see which of them will develop cognitive impairment some years later. And then we will see how was their performance before, during this dual task cost, and if it could enable us to distinguish this cognitive impairment group against the non-cognitive impairment group. So we will then see if the dual task cost can be used as a measure of cognitive reserve and as a protection for not developing cognitive impairment some years later. So thank you very much for your attention. I would like to thank my supervisors, PhD supervisors from the University of Coimbra, and my co-workers from Champalimaud Foundation. Thank you.